Popular depictions of medieval warfare often present missile combat as a spectacle of inexhaustible firepower, with archers releasing arrow after arrow as if ammunition were functionally unlimited. Generally speaking, such portrayals obscure a fundamental constraint that shaped every pre-modern army, the finite nature of its logistical system. The evidence suggests that the effectiveness of English longbowmen in the mid-14th century depended less on individual skill than on the ability of commanders to manage supply under battlefield conditions. A well-documented engagement during the early phases of the Hundred Years' War illustrates the consequences of failure in this respect. When an English force exhausted its arrow reserves, its tactical doctrine collapsed almost immediately, exposing the vulnerability of troops designed primarily for ranged combat. This episode highlights a broader structural problem. Missile warfare was not simply a matter of weapons technology or training, but of operational sustainability. English armies, which increasingly relied on large contingents of archers as a core component of their standing forces, required a dependable supply chain capable of sustaining high rates of ammunition expenditure. This investigation therefore examines not the mechanics of archery, but the institutional and logistical frameworks that determined whether English missile tactics could function at all. Within 14th century English armies, the longbowman occupied a role that was both tactically decisive and logistically fragile. English commanders increasingly structured their forces around dense formations of archers, whose purpose was to disrupt enemy advances, degrade armored opponents, and impose attritional dynamics before close combat even began. Generally speaking, the longbow was not simply an auxiliary weapon, it was integrated into operational doctrine as a primary instrument of battlefield control. According to contemporary historians, the English crown's growing reliance on archers reflected a broader institutional preference for flexible, relatively inexpensive manpower that could be mobilized in large numbers. Yet this system contained an inherent contradiction. The battlefield effectiveness of these troops depended on a steady flow of ammunition that individual soldiers could not carry in sufficient quantity for prolonged engagements. The standard unit of arrow supply was the sheaf, typically consisting of 24 shafts bundled for transport and accounting. Surviving administrative records indicate that most archers entered battle with 2 or 3 sheaves, yielding a personal reserve of roughly 48 to 72 arrows. In theoretical terms, this quantity appears substantial. In practice, it represented only a brief window of sustained fire. The debate over firing rates remains active in the historiography. Some scholars caution against accepting the highest estimates derived from later romanticized accounts, arguing that physical fatigue and the need for target selection imposed natural limits. Nevertheless, the evidence suggests that English military authorities expected a minimum performance threshold. Contemporary regulations imply that an archer incapable of releasing approximately 10 arrows per minute was considered unfit for effective service. This interpretation remains disputed in detail, but even conservative calculations reveal the scale of munition expenditure involved. At such a rate, a fully supplied archer could exhaust his carried ammunition in a matter of minutes during an intense exchange. The contrast between theoretical capacity and battlefield reality becomes clearer when examined through the lens of campaign logistics. English tactical doctrine often opened engagements with concentrated volleys intended to break enemy momentum. These opening phases demanded rapid material throughput, transforming each formation of archers into a temporary engine of mass consumption. A single company could discharge thousands of arrows in a short span, and when multiplied across an entire army, the cumulative effect was staggering. Modern scholarship has attempted to quantify this phenomenon. Robert Hardy, whose work on the English longbow remains influential, estimates that the archers at the Battle of Crecy may have loosed well over 500,000 arrows during the engagement and its associated operations. Even if one adopts a more cautious figure, the implication is the same. English battlefield success relied on ammunition volumes that approached proto-industrial scale. An early illustration of the danger inherent in this system occurred during a mid-14th century expedition led by an English governor operating from Calais.
His force, composed of men-at-arms supported by mounted archers, initially performed according to doctrinal expectations, repelling repeated assaults through disciplined missile fire. However, once their arrow reserves were depleted, the tactical balance shifted abruptly. The archers, lightly equipped for close combat, were forced into hand-to-hand fighting against better armored opponents. According to contemporary accounts, the collapse of their ranged capability precipitated a rapid defeat. This episode is significant not because it was unique, but because it exposes the structural limits of an army whose striking power was tied directly to consumable munitions. When supply failed, doctrine itself disintegrated. Such incidents underscore the fact that individual equipment loads were never intended to sustain an entire battle. They functioned as an initial buffer, buying time for resupply mechanisms to operate. English commanders were aware that archery, as a system, required continuous replenishment. The problem therefore extended beyond the soldier to the institutions responsible for maintaining arsenals and coordinating transport. During the 14th century, the English crown gradually expanded its administrative involvement in weapons procurement, recognizing that decentralized production alone could not meet wartime demand. Royal arsenals, particularly those associated with major urban centers and fortified hubs, began to serve as accumulation points where arrows were stored, inspected, and redistributed. These facilities represented an early attempt to impose centralized oversight on what had previously been a largely local craft industry. The scale of munition expenditure forced the monarchy to think in aggregate rather than individual terms. Campaign planning increasingly incorporated calculations of stockpiles, transport capacity, and replacement rates. According to contemporary historians, the English war effort in France cannot be understood without reference to this logistical dimension. The Crown's administrative correspondence reveals persistent anxiety over shortages, delays, and the uneven performance of regional suppliers. Even successful battles exposed the fragility of the system, since every victory consumed resources that had to be replaced before the next campaign season. In effect, the longbow transformed warfare into a contest not only of tactics, but of sustained production. What emerges from this background is a shift in analytical perspective. At the micro level, the archer appears as a skilled specialist operating a formidable weapon. At the macro level, he becomes a node within a larger network of supply, labor, and governance. The attritional dynamics of English missile tactics imposed demands that no individual could satisfy alone. They required coordinated campaign logistics capable of feeding a continuous stream of material into the battlefield environment. This reality helps explain why English military organization in the 14th century evolved in tandem with administrative reform. Tactical success depended on industrial-scale supply long before the advent of industrialization itself. By the time of the major set-piece battles of the Hundred Years' War, the decisive question was no longer whether archers could shoot effectively, but whether the state could sustain the material conditions that made their firepower possible. The pressure created by the scale of munition expenditure forced the English crown to confront a structural problem that could not be solved by battlefield improvisation alone. Generally speaking, the response was administrative rather than technological. The monarchy sought to expand its state capacity by integrating weapons production into a more coherent bureaucratic framework. During the later 14th and early 15th centuries, the English war effort increasingly relied on an administrative apparatus capable of centralized procurement, inspection, and redistribution. This development did not constitute industrialization in a modern sense, but it did represent a form of proto-industrial organization in which the crown coordinated dispersed producers through fiscal authority and legal compulsion. A particularly revealing example emerges during the reign of Henry V, whose preparations for renewed war in France illustrate the deliberate construction of a logistical system designed to sustain large standing forces of archers. According to contemporary historians, Henry recognized that earlier campaigns had exposed the fragility of English supply arrangements. His response was not merely to accumulate stockpiles, but to formalize oversight. Shortly after his accession, he issued prohibitions on the export of weapons and arrows to potential adversaries, an early sign that munitions were being treated as strategic resources subject to royal control. Such measures indicate a growing awareness that warfare required not only soldiers, but regulated access to material. The creation of specialized offices further demonstrates this shift. In 1413, Henry established a royal position dedicated specifically to arrow procurement and storage, appointing the Fletcher Nicholas Minot as keeper of the king's arrows. Stationed at the Tower of London, which functioned as the kingdom's principal arsenal, Minot operated within a defined bureaucratic hierarchy and was allocated funds to expand production. His office represents a concrete instance of institutional reform, transforming what had previously been a loosely supervised craft into a matter of state administration. Surviving records of his commissions reveal systematic ordering practices, including large contracts placed with named artisans in London and provincial towns. These transactions suggest an early form of centralized procurement in which the crown aggregated demand and directed production at scale. The supply chain architecture that supported this system extended deep into the countryside. When the monarchy required ammunition, writs were issued to county authorities, and sheriffs assumed responsibility for coordinating local production. County-based quotas were imposed, effectively converting regional craft capacity into a component of national defense. Arrow manufacture depended on multiple material inputs, each with its own logistical pathway. Suitable wood for shafts had to be selected, cut, and seasoned. Goose feathers of sufficient size and quality were gathered in enormous quantities. Iron heads were forged by specialist smiths, and horn reinforcements for knocks required additional artisanal labor. The assembly of these components illustrates a distributed production network in which rural resources were funneled towards centralized arsenals. Inspection and storage procedures reveal further layers of bureaucratic control. Once completed, arrows were bundled into standardized sheaths and delivered to designated collection points, often market towns where royal clerks supervised counting and quality checks. Only after inspection were they packed into barrels or crates for transport. The Tower of London, along with other royal depots, served as a logistical hub where munitions were catalogued and stockpiled. According to contemporary administrative correspondence, the arsenal functioned not merely as a warehouse, but as a clearinghouse that balanced incoming supplies against anticipated campaign requirements. This arrangement reflects an emerging understanding of inventory management within the constraints of medieval governance.
Despite these reforms, evidence of scarcity during peak mobilization persisted. The very scale of English preparations for continental campaigns strained the system to its limits. A mid-14th century record from a royal chamberlain complains that no arrows can be obtained because the king has taken for his use all the arrows that can be found anywhere. This primary source quotation, frequently cited in modern scholarship, illustrates the extent to which royal requisitioning could temporarily exhaust domestic markets. The statement should not be interpreted as rhetorical exaggeration. Rather, it reveals how concentrated resource mobilization disrupted ordinary economic circulation. Wartime demand effectively nationalized a critical sector of craft production. These shortages highlight a paradox within the English war economy. Centralization increased efficiency and predictability, yet it also exposed the crown to systemic risk if regional production faltered. Sheriffs who failed to meet quotas or artisans who delayed delivery could compromise campaign logistics. Consequently, administrative oversight intensified. Financial incentives, penalties, and contractual obligations were used to discipline suppliers, integrating them more tightly into the royal administrative apparatus. The relationship between monarchy and local governance thus became inseparable from the requirements of war. Military success depended on the crown's ability to translate authority into material throughput. From a structural perspective, the arsenals embodied the culmination of this mobilization process. They were physical manifestations of state capacity.
concentrating dispersed labor into tangible reserves of munitions. Each barrel of arrows stored in the tower represented a chain of extraction, manufacture, inspection, and transport coordinated by royal officials. According to contemporary historians, such facilities mark an important stage in the evolution of the English military fiscal system. They did not eliminate logistical constraints, but they created a framework within which those constraints could be managed. By the early 15th century, England possessed a logistical machine that, while fragile, was unprecedented in its scale and organization. The transition from ad hoc supply to an integrated system demonstrates how warfare accelerated administrative innovation. Archery, often celebrated for its tactical drama, was in fact sustained by paperwork, quotas, and warehouses. The monarchy's capacity to wage war rested on its ability to mobilize resources across the kingdom, aligning local economies with strategic objectives. As preparations intensified for major campaigns in France, this apparatus would soon face its decisive test. The battlefield would reveal whether centralized procurement and institutional reform were sufficient to sustain the immense material demands of English missile doctrine. The Agincourt campaign of 1415 provides the clearest example of this logistical apparatus operating under the extreme stress of active campaigning. Henry V's expeditionary force embarked for France with stockpiles assembled through the administrative reforms described earlier, and the subsequent march toward the interior tested the combat sustainability of those preparations. Generally speaking, the English army functioned as a mobile extension of the royal arsenals. Its baggage train carried not only provisions, but carefully accounted reserves of arrows intended to preserve the striking power of the longbow contingents. According to contemporary historians, the discipline imposed on supply distribution was as significant as the numbers involved. Archers did not simply fire at will, their commanders regulated munition expenditure in order to maintain tactical cohesion over the course of the campaign. When the English army encountered a numerically superior French force near Agincourt, the logistical groundwork translated directly into operational advantage. The battlefield deployment positioned dense formations of archers along the flanks, where their fire could act as a force multiplier against advancing French troops. Crucially, there is no contemporary indication that English units suffered a catastrophic shortage of arrows during the engagement itself. This absence of logistical failure is historically meaningful. Earlier episodes had demonstrated how quickly missile doctrine collapsed once ammunition was exhausted. At Agincourt, by contrast, sustained volleys were maintained long enough to disrupt successive French assaults, suggesting that resupply mechanisms functioned as intended. Tactical analysis of the engagement emphasizes the interaction between fire discipline and terrain. Muddy ground and constricted approach routes slowed the French advance, increasing the duration of exposure to English missile fire. Yet terrain alone does not explain the outcome. The archer's ability to continue shooting depended on the steady circulation of sheaves from rear positions to the firing line. According to the evidence, camp followers and support personnel played a key intermediary role, ensuring that individual archers could replenish their quivers without dismantling the formation. This logistical choreography preserved tactical cohesion at the moment of maximum pressure. The English line did not fragment into isolated groups scrambling for ammunition. It operated as an integrated system. Modern historians differ in the weight they assign to logistics relative to other factors, such as French command decisions or battlefield congestion. Some interpretations emphasize French tactical miscalculations, arguing that English success would have occurred even with more limited ammunition reserves. Others maintain that the decisive element was the sustained density of arrow fire, which could only be achieved through prior administrative preparation. This interpretation remains disputed in emphasis, but few scholars deny that the campaign demonstrated an unusual degree of organizational competence. The evidence suggests that Henry's administrative reforms had created a level of material reliability rare in medieval warfare. In operational terms, Agincourt validated the English model of centralized resource mobilization. The Longbow formations functioned not as isolated specialists, but as components of a supply-dependent weapons system. Their performance under stress confirmed that logistical planning had been successfully integrated into tactical doctrine. The battle therefore represents a turning point, not merely because of its immediate military result, but because it revealed the practical effectiveness of a bureaucratically managed war economy. The earlier tension between theoretical firepower and finite supply found temporary resolution on this field, where administrative foresight translated into sustained combat capability. In this sense, the engagement stands as a demonstration that victory could emerge from the quiet mechanics of procurement and distribution as much as from battlefield maneuver.
In the immediate aftermath of major engagements such as Agincourt, English military authorities confronted a reality that rarely appears in narrative chronicles. Victory generated its own logistical obligations. The battlefield was not the end point of the supply process, but a moment within a continuous maintenance cycle. Generally speaking, commanders treated spent ammunition as recoverable material rather than disposable waste. Post-engagement recovery formed an established, if imperfectly documented, component of campaign logistics. Once the field was secure, archers and camp laborers were directed to gather reusable arrows scattered across the ground. Contemporary administrative references indicate that significant quantities could be reclaimed in this manner, particularly when fighting occurred in confined areas where shafts remained concentrated. The economic logic behind this practice was straightforward. Arrow production consumed time, skilled labor, and scarce materials, especially iron heads and high-quality feathers. Material conservation therefore aligned with fiscal necessity. According to contemporary historians, the English crown understood that sustained campaigning required not only forward supply, but backward recovery. Reclaimed arrows were sorted, bundled, and transported to arsenals, where specialist craftsmen repaired damaged shafts, replaced fletching, and reforged points when possible. Surviving records describe teams of workers assigned specifically to refurbishment tasks, suggesting that repair was institutionalized rather than ad hoc. Even if only a fraction of recovered munitions could be restored to serviceable condition, the aggregate savings were significant. This system of post-engagement recovery reinforced the administrative role of royal depots. Arsenals functioned as nodes in a circular flow of resources, receiving both newly manufactured arrows and refurbished stock. Inspection procedures ensured that repaired munitions met minimum standards before reissue, maintaining consistency within the supply chain. The process illustrates an early awareness of life cycle management in military materiel. Rather than viewing campaigns as isolated expenditures, English authorities increasingly approached warfare as a cumulative enterprise, requiring careful stewardship of resources. Short-term lessons drawn from successful campaigns emphasized the necessity of preserving logistical discipline even in victory. Administrative correspondence after major operations frequently focused on replenishment schedules, transport bottlenecks, and the readiness of arsenals for subsequent deployments. The evidence suggests that English officials perceived no clear boundary between peacetime and wartime supply. Instead, they pursued a posture of continuous preparation, recognizing that the interval between campaigns was the critical window for rebuilding reserves. In this sense, the aftermath of battle was an administrative phase as consequential as the fighting itself. It revealed a military culture in which sustainability, rather than spectacle, defined operational success, and where the quiet routines of repair and accounting ensured that future armies could take the field with renewed capacity. Viewed over the longer term, the English experience with arrow supply during the Hundred Years' War points toward consequences that extend well beyond any single campaign. The repeated need to sustain large bodies of archers encouraged a gradual structural transformation in how the Crown conceptualized warfare.
Generally speaking, English success cannot be separated from the evolution of a logistical culture that treated munitions, transport, and storage as matters of permanent governance. The arsenals, procurement offices, and county quota systems developed in the 14th and early 15th centuries established an institutional precedent for later forms of centralized military administration. They did not yet constitute a fully developed military fiscal state, but they reveal an early stage in the process by which warfare drove bureaucratic expansion. Connections to later campaigns underline this continuity. English expeditions after Agincourt continued to rely on the same logistical principles: stockpiling in advance, regulating export of weapons, and coordinating regional production under royal oversight. According to contemporary historians, these practices became normalized features of English statecraft. Even when the tactical dominance of the longbow declined in the face of gunpowder weapons, the administrative habits forged in its support did not disappear. Instead, they were adapted to new technologies. In this sense, the arrow supply system can be interpreted as part of a broader medieval military transformation in which states learned to manage increasingly complex flows of material. Historiographically, this raises an enduring question about causality. Some scholars emphasize the tactical superiority of English archery, arguing that tactical technique explains the kingdom's most celebrated victories. Others contend that administrative capacity was equally decisive, since tactical systems collapse without reliable supply. This interpretation remains disputed in emphasis, yet the evidence suggests that the distinction may be artificial. Tactical innovation and logistical organization evolved together, each reinforcing the other. The long-term consequences of English warfare therefore lie not only in battlefield outcomes, but in the strengthening of institutional mechanisms capable of sustaining repeated campaigns. Placed within the wider medieval military history, the English case illustrates how logistical challenges acted as engines of state formation. The management of arrows required taxation, record-keeping, contractual enforcement, and bureaucratic oversight, all of which expanded the reach of royal authority. Warfare functioned as a laboratory for administrative experimentation, producing structures that outlived the specific conflicts that created them. The central lesson is analytical rather than dramatic. Missile victories were visible expressions of a deeper system in which governance, economy, and military organization converged. By tracing the supply of a single weapon, one observes the emergence of patterns that would shape European warfare for centuries. The growing interdependence of battlefield performance and institutional capacity. This perspective offers a framework for interpreting pre-modern conflict not as a sequence of isolated clashes, but as a continuous negotiation between violence and administration, where the durability of states depended as much on warehouses and clerks as on soldiers in the field.